Hello EDUSPLORERs, thanks for joining us again and welcome back to another exciting and informative video on our YouTube channel. If you are joining us for the first time, we want to thank you for watching. In this episode, I will be looking at the reason why reforming the African Union is long overdue. In this episode, I will dive into the reason why the African Union is trying to revitalize itself through the continent-wide free trade area. I would look into its reform strategy. It's realistic by downplaying political in favor of economic integration. I will also touch into the lack of consensus and the worsening security outlook put the trade deals at risk at some particular regions in the continent of Africa. More importantly, I will also look at the reason why the continent of African free trade arrangement is at the implementation phase, a huge leap with regards to the time when it was created. I will also close this episode at looking at some scenarios. I will encourage you to watch this video to the end for clarity and better understanding. So without any much delay, let's just dive straight into it. Africa in 2018 was marked by important advances on the economic front. With the agreement to create a continental free trade area, the CFTA, while trade liberalization has the potential to be transformative for Africa, desperate stages of development, protectionist and also impulses and political tension may prevent meaningful advances. If you look at different aspects, founded in 2002, the African Union, the AU as it's abbreviated, evolved through delicate balance of federalist ambitions and also gradualist approach. Inspired by the European Union, what focused on economic integration and political cooperation without compromising state sovereignty. However, 16 years after and counting its creation, and much like the European Union model, the African Union finds itself stemmed by an over-centralized and also inefficient structure and a lack of financial means needed to achieve its goals. Moving ahead, African countries most likely agree that financial independence is needed for a stronger African Union, but many lack the resources or political will to fulfill their obligation. The Arab Spring and also economic crisis gripping to the continent, leading economies at a time like Algeria, Egypt, Morocco and Nigeria and South Africa together provide 60% of African Union's contribution, have negatively affected the organization's finances. Even when recent improvements, lower spending, the introduction of a 0.2% import levy on member states to fund the EU in new sanctions on countries that do not honor their pledges. About 59% of the African Union's 2019 budget is funded by non-African donors. If you look at the transformative nature with regards to the continent of Africa and the geopolitics in the region, diversity is also a challenge in the continent with 55 countries and over 2,000 ethnic groups. African political and economic models range from full-fledged democracies to authoritarian regimes, from market to statistics economic, and also from middle income to desperately poor countries. If you look at that, in 2018, under the leadership of Rwandan President Paul Kagame, who assumed the rotating chairmanship of the African Union Assembly, and the organizations gained new momentum, Mr. Kagame, known for his pragmatism and also reformist bent, is admired by his African counterparts as a firm advocate of African solutions for African problems. His plan for overhauling the African Union focuses on 4 key areas: political affairs, peace and security, economic integration, and representing Africa on the world stage. If you look at the trade opportunity in the continent of Africa, the reforms offers 2 main opportunities for African Union which, if seized, will boost African economics and also continent's position on the global order. The first step is the creation of a free trade. While it's not an auspicious time for free trade at the global level, history shows that it has been a crucial factor in curbing poverty and fostering economic growth. In the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which aimed to create a single continental market for goods and services, including free movement of people, businesses and also capital. Once it's ratified, which has been done already, levels of inter-African trade are still modest, reflecting obstacles like high tariffs and poor infrastructure. According to the African Export Export-Import Bank, this intracontinental trade amounted to over 180 billion in 2016, accounted for just 15% of Africa's overall foreign trade, compared, for example, with 67% in the European Union and 58% in Asia. Average import duties within Africa are estimated at about 6.1%, which means that intra-African export are often more costly than intercontinental export. If you look at that, informed cross-border trade in turn is source of income to about 43% of the continent's population, according to a 2012 study by the African Development Bank. This astonishing high total is part due to the large size of the African informal sector and the permeability of the borders, which allows thriving unregistered trade in everything from cattle and foodstuff to manufacturing goods and drugs. For some African economies, the continental free trade area could be an opportunity for economic recovery and growth. Easy access to African markets will encourage much needed diversification of export, meanwhile encouraging economies of scale and higher productivity. For small and medium-sized enterprises, the key drivers of economic and diversification and growth across Africa, the CFTA as was known then, will well transform trade across the continent of Africa by opening across borders and market easily navigated by also such firms. The agreement inclusion of trade in services is expected to positively impact services-oriented economies such as Kenya or Rwanda. With the CFTA, or you call it the African Continental Free Trade, with the AFCFTA, Africa could also be better positioned to exploit global trade trends and use its bargaining power vis-a-vis other countries and also economic blocs. The post-Brexit difficulties of European trade and also escalating tariff war between the United States and China could increasingly attractive nature in terms of the African market and suppliers. If you look on political realism, the logic behind the African Union reform effort is based on realism. In Africa, where the state's sovereignty is recent and in many cases fragile, taking political approach to integration will be a non-starter. While there seems to be growing consensus for economic liberalization, as seen, for example, by the rhetoric and practices of new leaders in Angola and Zimbabwe, there is less agreement on political liberalization. This may explain why political cooperation, one of the four pillars of the reformed African Union, is given the more announced label of political affairs efficiency rather than normative, and also conceptual aspect about politics seem to be the priority. If you look at other areas, taking this approach is only sensible in a global context marked by the decline of liberal internationalism as well, and on a continent where pluralistic of political regimes makes the imposition of common liberal standards a highly unrealistic goal. This does not mean, however, that the African Union political role is meaningless. For example, its firm stand against unlawful seizures of power has worked as an effective deterrent, helping strengthen constitutionalism, though sometimes only in the formalistic sense, and increasingly stability across the continent. If you look at what happened in the Sahel region, considering France's involvement in the continent of Africa, some of those leaders in the regions have taken powers in their own hands to fight for the future of their own people. We all shall be looking on how things transform in Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and also in Niger. If you look at other areas with regards to the African Union, also importance in the African Union recent focus on corruption as an obstacle to good governance and economic development. Losses due to illicit financial outflows in Africa were recently estimated at about $80 billion a year by Thabo Mbeki, the former South African president who chaired the African Union and also the United Nations high-level panel on illicit financial flows in the continent of Africa. These thought stands reflect a growing Pan-African trend, and as corruption has moved to the top of the political agenda in countries like Rwanda, Nigeria, Tanzania, and also Angola, the African Union has launched 2018 at the time as an anti-corruption year to be championed by the Nigerian Nigerian President Muhammad Buhari when he was still in power. However, if you consider the scenario with regards to the African Union's reform, while these reforms could be bringing some real gains in African Union effectiveness and financial economy, the greatest potential for transformation in the medium and long term is in the domain of economic integration with the implementation of the CFTFA, as was called then. This potential reflects a combination of factors. Economic integration is something almost all member states can agree on. If successfully implemented, it will drive economic growth, diversification, and job creation. Also, freer trade could have the collateral effect of improving political stability and security. Those benefits are by no means certain, however. Given Africa's extreme economic diversity, political complexity, and security risk, two quite different outcomes are possible. Let me jump into the first outcome here. Bumpy path to growth in the continent of Africa. Under this more likely scenario, the revamped African Union and the CFTA would have a varied importance across the continent, but the long-term result will be positive. This scenario proposes also that a consensus about the advantages of free trade will prevail after the protectionist interests of some countries and pressure of a protracted tense negotiation. Inevitably, the CFTA will create winners and losers in competitive economies like Mauritius, Botswana, Namibia, or Rwanda. The benefits of a large market would offset potential risk of higher competitive nature and lower customs revenue, because manufactured products account for a bigger share of export to other African countries than overseas, where demand is greatest for African commodities. More diversified economies like Morocco, Kenya, Ethiopia, Senegal, and also Ivory Coast will be well positioned to be benefiting from the CFTA. The same goes for reforming countries like Angola, where President João Lourenço is trying to diversify the liberalizing economy dominated in other ways in terms of petroleum and other issues with regards to Angolan situation. Resource-dependent countries like Chad and Republic of the Congo or Zambia are expected to belong among the losers, at least in the short run, but the long-term impact could be a positive event in the states where, depending on the ability to adopt mitigation strategies and making structural changes, the outlook for resource-dependent dictatorships like Equatorial Guinea, where authoritarian rule coincides with economic centralization, is mainly negative. In other countries including South Africa, Nigeria, Cameroon, Zimbabwe, and then the CFTFA effect would heighten on the political development and also internal security situation. Almost by definition, a more effective African Union will contribute to political stability across the continent. The same goes for implementation of the free trade economic area, since economic gains over the long run tend to drive political stabilization and liberalization reforms, as we all have seen in some regions. The implementation of the CFTA, as was known then, should also increase the leverage of African countries in crucial negotiation, including Brexit trade agreement with the United Kingdom and renegotiation of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, granting access to US market for African goods that expires in 2025. We all have seen what happened in the meeting recently in the country of South Africa. If we look at the second scenario here, road to nowhere. Upon this less probable scenario, implementation of the CFTA will be blocked or sustainability limited by lack of political will among member states or deterioration of the security outlook. In other case, the African Union's image and operational capacity will be weakened. Several developments could also produce such unfavorable outcomes. Then, the first will be a lack of consensus in which the countries state out the CFTA on only half-heartedly implementing provisions. But again, this has already happened. Hopefully we've informed you as to the reason why reforming the African Union is long overdue. However, the African states have moved swiftly to also carry out the African continental free trade to the implementation phase. We shall be looking at the already existing challenges and how the continent plans to overcome those particular issues as we move towards the next couple of years. We want to thank you for watching the Explorer. We shall be looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye bye.